My name is Peter Young, and I'm the Managing Director of the Free Cities Foundation. I'm joined today by Francisco Litvay, who's a member of our Ambassador Network. Francisco is a digital nomad and entrepreneur from Brazil who specializes in special economic zones and autonomous cities. And we're going to have a conversation about how Francisco became interested in autonomous cities as a way of encouraging development, and in particular, the situation in Brazil and how that's changed over time. So, Francisco, thank you very much for joining us today.
A pleasure to be here, Peter.
So I wanted to start off by kind of painting a bit of a picture of your life and how you got interested in special economic zones. So you left your country to become a digital nomad at quite a young age, the age of 17. Were you interested at this stage in autonomous cities? What was it that kind of prompted you to leave and undertake this big journey?
Well, I actually left Brazil to do my higher education in Europe. I have an Austrian grandfather, so since an early age, I was already learning German and getting into those networks. And because of that, I always had the dream of going to study in Austria. Also, because in high school, I got into Austrian economics and that whole libertarianism rabbit hole. I went to Austria wanting to study and also wanting to learn Austrian economics. It was a shame that, of course, they don't teach that there in the economics university. So I ended up going for an informatics course instead. And I was doing my university period in Austria that I, as someone who's interested in libertarianism and Austrian economics, got into the idea of free private cities, free cities, and special economic zones, primarily by reading the work of Tom W. Bell, Your Next Government, and also Titus Gebel's Free Private Cities. So that's how that connection came about.
So for any listeners that aren't familiar with the Austrian school and how that differs from other schools of economics, can you just give us a quick overview?
Well, the Austrian school has a focus on many things that are left aside, let's say, by at least the schools of economics that we learn more about in Brazil, like Keynesianism and Marxism, and just overall the mainstream. It has a focus on subjective value. It has a focus on entrepreneurship and the contribution of the individual. It has, because of the conclusions that it draws upon, it's also much more free market oriented, much more entrepreneurship oriented. And because of that, it attracted me a lot, right? It goes very much hand in hand, this libertarianism, free market economics, and Austrian economics.
Okay, so you went to Austria as seeking to learn a bit more about the Austrian school, obviously having heard about that pretty young and then trying to pursue this family connection that you had there. And how did this then work into you going full time as a digital nomad working on the special economic zone space? What was the process that you went through from studying informatics to becoming a digital nomad?
Yeah, I think this part can be very interesting to the younger audience that is listening to this and is wondering how to get into fields that they're very interested in. So how I got into this field, I was still studying. I was a tutor at the university actually for like coding classes. That was my part-time job. And I had read the Free Private Cities book. I was very interested in the topic. So I started following this author guy, Titus Gebel, on Facebook and on his networks. And one day he posts that he is looking for an assistant that preferably lives in Europe, speaks German and English, and also who has a familiarity with the concept of free private cities to work with him on the Free Private Cities back then Foundation, now the Free Cities Foundation. And well, I applied. I spoke German, I spoke English, I also spoke Portuguese. I had a good networking with the libertarian people over there. So I also, came up with a plan on, hey, let's promote this on Brazil. I think, that could be a good audience. And that's how I got in, right? So I started as an executive assistant to Titus at Free Private Cities, then eventually became the executive manager together with him, operations manager, sorry. And then afterwards, just started working more and more in the industry, connecting with people in other organizations. So the Startup Societies Foundation, talking with people from Seasteading, from, Pronomos, all the different organizations that are involved there. I did some writing work as well for the Institute for Competitive Governance back in the day. And yeah, so eventually networked myself into this industry and just became my thing. Right afterwards, I really stopped focusing on the informatics part and started focusing more on the special economic zones and free cities industry. So that became my main career, let's say.
So many people that are into more libertarian ideas or the Austrian School of Economics, they might focus more on stuff like money and banking or on how to influence mainstream political processes. Can you tell me a bit about what it was about cities in particular or special zones that was the thing that made you say, this is what I want to make my niche?
Yeah, so I got very attracted by the ideas of competitive governance and how to, change governance systems. What originally attracted me most by the free cities idea is how they make governance voluntary, right? That is one of the main, critiques of the state, that it's coercion, that it's institutionalized coercion. And because it's coercive, it's never going to be as efficient as a free market where everything is voluntary and everyone stands to gain by every transaction, right? When it's coerced, party is always losing because he's being forced to something that he didn't want. And these free cities, because governance is voluntary through a contract, they really attracted me. Nowadays, after having been in the industry for a longer time, it's also just seeing how they facilitate life for entrepreneurs, for example, and just helping make business easy, helping you be able to actualize your business in a way that would not be possible if the cities were not there. And also how they can have an effect of helping reform a whole country, right? Where first you have one zone or a couple of zones, and then these grow, and then these show how something better can be done. And then this helps set off reform at a national level. So it's something that is also, being done in Brazil, and we can talk later about that. But it's, starting small and then reforming big places because of these zones.
Kind of like a practical way of experimenting at a small level and then taking it up to something bigger. And that's part of the reason why I'm also interested in this idea, because you don't have to convince an entire population. You can start something, build something new, and you can give people the choice to voluntarily move there. If they like it, it'll be successful. If they don't, then it won't. It's a kind of entrepreneurial venture. So it's also something that drew me to the concept. But we've talked so far about some different kinds of models. So we've used the term special economic zone. We've used the term free private city. You mentioned charter cities as well. So can you, would you mind just giving a quick definition? Like, what do you see as the difference between a free private city, a charter city, and a special economic zone?
All right, so let's get into the taxonomy of it. That's actually some work we had to do when we were creating the open zone map. So we created this map of all special economic zones across the globe. And one of the main challenges was, how do we, categorize these different kind of things that we're dealing with? So special economic zone, I would say, is the umbrella term of a special jurisdiction, a jurisdiction that is, geographically delimited and has different rules from its host state, right? That's a special economic zone. Usually we're talking about just, regulatory breaks, corporate tax incentives, import, export duties incentives, these kinds of very basic doing business incentives, right? And charter cities and free private cities are both concepts that go deeper. So charter cities focus on having a jurisdiction with substantial reform, not just like, making, one-stop shop for applying for licenses, but something substantial like, we're implementing a common law regime in this otherwise civil law country, or we're having a special complete sandbox for crypto regulation, for example, like they have in Cayman Enterprise City. So, we're talking about deep regulatory reform that can really, change how an industry works, or that can, be the basis for new business models, right? Not just, reducing taxes by 5%, but no, let's make this a crypto safe haven. This is, something special. And free private cities are very similar to charter cities, I would say. Like also the circles, the networks, you see that they they intersect a lot. People who are talking about charter cities are often also talking about free private cities and vice versa. Free private cities, I would say, is the more libertarian offshoot of the term, right? So while charter cities is being used now by more mainstream groups, also being talked about in the World Bank and more academic studies, and it was originally coined by Paul Romer, who's also a mainstream Nobel prize-winning economist. And free private city is a term that I think is more libertarian oriented. It's more used by free market people, and it makes sense. Free, private, those are two words that libertarians like to hear a lot. So, and besides that, I would also emphasize the focus on this contract model, right? Well, charter cities may or may not have a contract model. They may be public charter cities or private charter cities or public-private, while free private cities are more focused on the private component and on the being voluntary component, something that I don't think is necessary for a charter city.
Yeah, that's how I tend to think about it as well. The clue is in the name, in the sense that charter cities are defined by having a charter, which people might think is more akin to a constitution, whereas the free private cities model has a contract between the city operator and the individual citizen. And that contract could be different for different citizens. Different citizens might have different needs from their operator, so they could have their own individual contract. And as you say, there's that emphasis on it being a business model. So it's good to have those kind of terms clearly defined. And you mentioned there in your answer the open zone map. That's a really impressive project. I think you said it contained over 2,000 different zones that are based around the world, and you played a key role in developing that, as I understand. So can you tell us a little bit about what that project was and what the rationale was for developing such a comprehensive overview of all the zones that there are out there?
So the open zone map actually has around 7,000 data points. Last time I remember the count. But it's a project by the Adrianople group, a company I'm a director of internationalization in. And the idea was to create what really for a long time has been the holy grail of the special economic zone industry. A database of all the special economic zones in the world. This is something that many groups had tried before and they had all failed, right? Some tried and got like a couple hundred zones, but then stopped. Some tried doing more, just scraping methods to get as much as possible, but then ended up mixing non-zones with zones. So we really wanted to create what is a very daring project, just gathering every single special economic zone in the world and putting it on a database, putting it on a map so that people can find them and can study them and can use them also for their own private purposes. It's a completely open source project, so anyone can go there, click on every dot, learn about any zone, and if you're a student or an academic, you can also get the database from us directly. So it was really about creating this public good, let's say, for the special economic zones industry, so that there can be more knowledge and more study and more knowledge in the special economic zones industry.
Looking at the open zone map, one of the things that struck me was just the sheer number of projects that were involved. And we often make this point when we're talking to decision makers at the Free Cities Foundation. We say that actually there are thousands and thousands of different special economic zones out there, when in fact what we and the Charter Cities Institute and other kinds of organizations are proposing is not just something that's a special economic zone where you'd kind of tinker with the tax level, or you would tinker with the tariffs or the labor policies. It's like a wholesale kind of reform from the bottom up. That was interesting to see, just the sheer number of projects that were included. Was there anything in particular that stood out for you when you were undertaking that process, that surprised you, that you learned from it, that you thought, actually, this has really changed the way that I see special economic zones and their place in the world?
Well, there are many things actually that are quite surprising if you look at it. For example, the difference in the ownership structures of zones, right? So if you go to Asia, you're going to see a lot more public zones. If you go in the Americas, you're going to see a lot more public-private partnerships, private zones in general. You can see zones in very unusual places as well. So, for example, a lot of people think that Cuba and North Korea are these, completely communist, isolated, closed economies, whereas in realities, they are, they indeed are, but they have special economic zones where people can do business more easily and pay less taxes and not be, into all these regulations that they have. So North Korea, for example, has Razon, SEZ, and Cuba has Mariel, SEZ, right? So these are two communist countries admitting basically that, oh yeah, if we want to do business better, we better change some of the rules we have here. So that's something you would not expect, right? That it would be possible for a South Korean company to be doing business in North Korea through a special economic zone.
Special economic zones exist in lots of strange and unexpected places around the world. It would be good to learn a bit more about what the state of play is in Brazil, because obviously this is where you're from and you're very familiar with the state of play in Brazil. So can you tell us a little bit about how many special economic zones there are in Brazil, what sort of things they have, and what's different about Brazil's special economic zones?
Brazil has a number of special economic zones and has actually different special economic zone regimes at the same time, right? They don't have a unified special economic zone legislation. There are in fact two different ones. There are the free trade zones that are in the north, basically in the Amazon region. So you have the focus there is the free zone of Manaus. And that is one of the main industrial centers of Brazil. Actually, you have a lot of hardware and technology being produced there because of all the tax incentives. And you also have the export processing zones, which until very recently were a real failure, right? You had the regime which was created more than 20 years ago, and in all this time, from the more than 20 approved ones, you only had one that was operating, the Pecém zone in the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Ceará, which is where you also have one of the biggest steel mills of the country. And the extra processing zones show how sometimes bad things can come for the good. A bad occasion can turn into a good thing, which is, you had this export processing zones regime in Brazil, which was very bad, very bad. Just to give an example, 80% of all the production had to be exported. You couldn't, sell it in the internal Brazilian market. Only 20% could be sold, and with a fine. It was also super bureaucratic to establish them. It was only, done by the federal government. It was just overall a very bad regime. And because of that, you had a lot of approved projects all over the country. Yeah, let's create these special economic zones. Let's start doing things. But in the end, only one became operative. But then COVID hit. And in the Pecém zone, you had also an industry that was producing oxygen and was producing equipment that could be used for COVID treatment and COVID support. But oh wait, we can't use this in our own country. And then COVID hit. You had all this pandemic situation where Brazil was in a bad state. And okay, wait, we have this thing we're producing, which could be used to treat this pandemic, to help alleviate this pandemic in our own country, but we're legally not allowed to use it here, right? We have to send it to other countries. So why are we doing this? And then this started talks about reforming the export processing zone regime again, which was something that since the very beginning, people were talking, yeah, we should reform this. It's not up to global standards. But then this was a catalyst also to get the talks going again. And what came out of this was a reform last year, which flexibilized a lot of things in the zone regime. First of all, no more export requirement. You can sell everything in the domestic market if you want. Of course, then you have to pay the normal taxes if you do. You're not going to get the tax incentives if you don't export. But hey, you can if necessary. Then they also added a lot of things which make it more flexible and get it closer to what you would want for a charter city. So for example, the zones don't have to be created by the federal government anymore. They can be requested by state governments. They can be requested by municipalities, and they can be requested by the private sector as well. If you're a company or a conglomerate or something like that, you can create a plan and submit it to have a special economic zone created on your own factories, for example. And so this already flexibilizes how you can create them. And this makes it that zones can be established in more favorable locations than before, because before it was only, oh yeah, the federal government is putting it in areas that are already a bit not as good economically so that they can get developed. Other things include, for example, that you have private management of the zones, that you can have the zones not be contiguous, like in Honduras, like in the Settee, for example. You can have one zone have different stretches of land. Of course, they can't be too far apart. There's still some restrictions, but they don't have to be contiguous anymore. You don't have to have everything being done inside the zones. So, for example, your accounting, supporting services, they don't have to be inside the zone anymore. So overall, it brought Brazil to global standards, closer to global standards when it comes to special economic zones for doing business. It's still not possible to live there. It's not a city, but it just opened a lot of opportunities, right? Another example is that the zones were previously only for industry, and now they're for services as well. So if you're a service company, you can establish yourself there. And what the result of this is that from these 20 something projects that were inactive for so long, now you're having a lot of them being reactivated. So one in my home state in Santa Catarina, you have one in the state of Bahia, in Ilhéus, you have some, I think 2 in the north that are being reactivated, and you're getting cities that want to create their own zones now. So I've already heard of 3 other zones that are now being created because of this reform. And what I find most interesting about this is, before you only had one lobbyist for trying to reform the special economic zones, the zone in Ceará. Now you're going to have more and more industries that use the special economic zones. You're going to have more and more people from across different states that are using the special economic zones. So this is also another way of driving reform to the whole country, is that before the zones were weak and it took like 20 years to get a small reform. Now with more and more people using the zones and benefiting from them, there are already talks of trying to do a second wave of reform, let's say, in the next year. So, see if we can expand that even more. And yeah, so this is an example of how you can do zone reform, and how doing zone reform can then help reform the whole country.
So it sounds like you're pretty optimistic about these developments, and you think that there's going to be some good results that come from it.
Yes, we have to see how the next government is going to be in Brazil, right? There is the possibility of a not so zone friendly government coming into power, but still it's a big step, right? It was a big reform. And there's also other things that Brazil has going for it, right? So, for example, not that many people know, but Brazil actually had an attempt to create charter cities already, right? And in the economic freedom law that was passed some time ago, I think like 2-3 years ago by now, they basically created this law where they tried to add every single item of economic freedom to the list to make a mega reform in the economic freedom index of the country. And they added a paragraph there about every single state having an area of up to, I think, 0.1% of its total territory, but keep in mind, Brazil is huge. Having an area with this percentage of the territory that would be exempt from the municipal and the state laws, and that it could create its own regulation when it came to that, right? So it would basically create charter cities at every single Brazilian state. So 27 charter cities. That would already be a lot more than you already have in Honduras, for example. So that was an attempt. It didn't go through. And from what I talked to people in Brazil, it didn't go through because there was particular opposition to that paragraph that people, we hate charter cities here. It was more because they really packed the law with everything they could, and then it went through the traditional Chamber of Deputies and Senate procedure, which is, okay, we're going to strip this down to the bare minimum and then keep it going. So it got removed. It didn't go through, but there was already an attempt, and this attempt can serve maybe as a basis for future reforms to implement that as well.
So have you actually made site visits to many of these zones within Brazil? Can you tell us a little bit about what they're actually like to be in?
So I did not get to visit the free trade zone in Manaus, although I got the invitation, and also the extra processing zone in the north. I was not able to visit either of them, but they're standard business parks, standard extra processing zone. So, fenced area, it's like a port, it's a, business park. What I did get to see while I was in Brazil last time was some of its private cities. We're talking about free private cities. Brazil doesn't have free private cities or free cities, but it does have private cities to an extent. This is something that you're seeing actually increasingly in the developing world. So, for example, Gurgaon in India is an example of a private city. It's not a charter city, but it's a private city. And you have examples of these in Brazil as well, right? These planned neighborhoods that eventually become planned, really, cities in scope. Like you have some of these that have over 30,000, over 40,000 inhabitants, so the size of a small city, all across Brazil, right? And these are developments that are from the private sector, so it's privately built, privately operated, that are implementing like really top-notch urbanism practices, and they're trying to become smart cities as well. And that is some of the most expensive real estate you can actually find because people want to live there. It's more secure. They have this private security that is taking a look all over the place. And the infrastructure is good. I got to visit Cidade Pedra Branca, which is a private city next to the capital of the state of Santa Catarina, so next to Florianopolis. And there, this private city development, which already has, I think, 30,000 inhabitants, 20,000 inhabitants, something like that, they brought so many new technologies and practices and so on that they're basically giving an upgrade to the municipality that they are in, right? They started implementing some sewage systems and some like security practices that were then passed on to the municipality, right? They didn't have that, and then they're copying the private city to improve the governance services. So that is a very interesting thing, right? Like they're setting the standard for the public cities, so to say. And you have these private developments all over Brazil, right? You have the Alphaville neighborhood in São Paulo. You have Planet Smart City in the Northeast. You have this city in the South. You have also Cidade Orbital, which is I think the biggest real estate development in Brazil, which is a satellite city to the capital, Brasilia. So you have a lot of these private cities that are growing in scope. They're growing in size, they're growing in the amount of things that they're doing, like the amount of services that they're providing. And they're not free yet, but maybe with a reform of the export processing zones regime, maybe in the future they can become a zone too.
So who are the main people that are living in these zones at the moment? Because one of the things that Brazil is quite known for is that there's quite a large wealth gap, I think. And also when some people that are more critical of the idea of a private city would focus on it being a kind of preserve for wealthier people. So what's the state of play in Brazil? Are you seeing that these private cities are being inhabited by people that are across the socioeconomic spectrum, or does it tend to be wealthier people that can afford to build their own place and have an alternative structure for utilities and these public services that you were mentioning?
It depends. Like some neighborhoods like Alphaville, for example, it's known for being a bit more upscale, right? And the one that I visited it is more targeted towards, upper middle class, upper class. But you have to keep in mind, this is not like a fenced in HOA that is like, oh, the rich are secluding themselves into their own neighborhood that is isolated from society. No, again, this is a place where you can just walk in and you can go to the school, you can go to the university that they have there, you can go to the shopping centers. It's completely connected in the existing city, and it's providing also services to the city, right? It's helping make the existing city better. And insofar, these private cities, these planned cities I don't think you could call them exclusive because, again, they're completely integrated, right? There's no barrier to entry. And I think this is the main component, actually, that sets apart, a private city, like a planned neighborhood, from a, condo or HOA, right? That it's not secluded, it's part of the real city.
So it's not like a gated community, which you do get quite a few of in Latin America, where there's a single firm that will man the gates and you have to check in and out every time you drive your car in or walk in. it's just an area where the utilities and the public services are provided privately through some kind of local, is it like a local tax, or is it like a service charge that these individual houses will pay? How does it work?
Basically, you have this private developer, right? You have these big real estate developers in Brazil, and this real estate developer will, make the plan of the city. He will build the city, and then the people who are going to live there, they automatically become members of this residents association, which then has a small fee that you have to pay to be a member. And this association then helps manage the governance of the city, right? So it does have in a certain sense like this HOA politics, you could call, because you have an association where people are present. But it's not the completely, I don't have anything to do with the community model that you would have in some models of free private cities that are sometimes suggested, like, oh no, I just have a contract with the operator, and I don't have any participation rights, but I don't care because I'm free. In this case, you do have a certain amount of participation rights because you're obligatorily becoming a member of this association, but you also don't have to be active if you don't want. It's more so you have this coordination mechanism. This association also helps then, is the one that talks to the city, that also talks to other entities. So it's connecting that private city to other mechanisms, to other institutions, in the region.
So are people that are resident in these places exempt from certain other taxes, or do they basically just have to pay like a homeowners association type fee on top of everything that they're already paying to the local government and the central government?
That's why we're not calling them free private cities yet, because they're not special economic zones, right? So they don't have any tax incentives in comparison to any other part of Brazil. But there is still a high demand to move to these places because of the higher quality of life, for the better infrastructure, for the better urbanism, for the good schools, good universities, job opportunities when these places are done right. So in this case, it was very well planned in the sense of like integrating industry and technology, and they got to grow in university also partially because of that. And in the sense, it became a place where people go to work as well, right? To go to work and to go to study. So there are many reasons you would move, even not considering free cities, why you would move to another jurisdiction, and they try to add these attractives there, even though they can't offer the tax incentive.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about in terms of Brazilian urbanism is the favelas, because many people, when they think about Brazilian cities, they think about the informal housing developments that tend to build around the outside of cities and develop there, and they have a reputation for being places where life maybe isn't so great. So can you tell us a little bit about why Brazil in particular has developed this reputation for having large favelas, and what's the kind of historical and economic circumstances that have led to that?
So the slums, not only in Brazil, right? You have them in many other places, but it really dates back to a long time ago, when you had people in these cortiços, like these, you could call them co-living areas, but it's a bad way to say it. But you had basically the demolition of these, lower income housing types, which forced people into other areas. You had, just also other economic circumstances, like, for example, when the slaves were freed, there was initially a plan to provide them with land so that they could, start their own living. But then afterward, there was a coup in Brazil. And because of that, this plan never got implemented. So, the slaves got freed and they had nowhere to go and nothing to do. And this also worsens economic conditions and gets people to then, just try to find a way to go to where there is work, where there is jobs. Right. And that those would be the big cities like São Paulo, like Rio de Janeiro. And then if you don't have land, well, you start to build in these areas where there's, basically no regulation, no regulation at all. Right. So until very recently, you just don't have these land titles and, the traditional property rights inside these slums, inside these favelas. Right. And something that is that is nice, that is a good development actually, and shows how you have some places that are really looking to innovate inside Brazil, is that the municipality of Rio announced during the Rio Innovation Week that they're going to start using blockchain to register all the different properties inside the favelas, right? So that the people there can finally have a real land title, have a real claim to their land, and not just like, oh yeah, my family has been living here for 3 generations. So that is also a big, step up in property rights for these people, I'd say.
So sometimes when people talk about the idea of private governance or unregulated governance is what some people call it. When they think about a private city or a free market city, they might think about the kind of dynamics you see in a slum area. So can you just make the case as to why you think those sorts of you wouldn't have that much of a similarity? What are the key differences, and what would life be like in a city run by a private operator, but with very clearly defined property rights versus life in a slum area?
It's hard to even like say the difference, because it's actually, I don't think there's many similarities at all at what we're looking at, right? Like the favela is a result of, just this unorganized, chaotic process of people having to move to these locations for economic opportunities where, they have little money, they can't move into the more like plans part of the city, the more developed part of the city, and then they have to make do with this cheaper housing, and then commute from the favela to their workplaces every day. And in these areas, you do have a lack of governance, a lack of government control, especially in the case of Rio de Janeiro, where you have a lot of these slums being managed by the mafia, and the drug cartels. It's just that is a place where it was not planned, it was not prepared, it was not, you didn't have a vision for preparing it. And it's just been created in very bad conditions, right? All the projects that we're looking at for private cities is, we're going to start with a community and then we're going to grow it. And, you have a plan for how to do it, and you would have a governance entity. Right. The reason why the favelas have this control is because there was no control. There was no government, no governance oversight at all. Right. There was no entity that was managing public life and the landscaping and the services and all. It was just uncontrolled and organized. And then the drug cartels came in. Right. And then now they run the show. Or the police mafias basically, and now they run the show, and they became a government of their own, right? So, but that is completely different from a private operator, because again, we're talking about being voluntary and not coerced. And it's not exactly that voluntary contractual with your local mob boss.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the difference is it's not completely unregulated in the sense that there are no rights and there are no protections, but more that there is a particular authority that voluntarily and transparently sets what those regulations are. And you can have different ideas about where those regulations go, but I think at the core of our guiding philosophy is the idea that the regulations should all be there to protect private property rights, and that can be things like the rights to the air, or to have noise in your area or to not have noise in your area after a certain time at night, or not to breathe polluted air, or not to have your rights of way encroached upon by other people. These can all be conceived of in terms of private property rights. So given we've been talking about less well-off areas of Brazil, can you make a basic case for why you think special economic zones or free private cities or charter cities are particularly important for people who are towards the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum? Why do you think it's important for them in terms of improving their lives?
Quite simple, economic opportunity. So you already had a big success in the Pecém economic zone. Again, it has the largest steel mill in Brazil, and it's a big port, and that employs a lot of people. And what you see is also that in many countries, the special economic zones workers are better remunerated than workers outside, because the jobs offered in the zone, of course, this depends. You have zones that are sometimes focused towards lower lower income work. But in the case of Brazil now, what they're wanting to do is services and industrial development. So these zones attract high paying jobs, which are very necessary in Brazil, right? You have a situation of like high inflation, high unemployment, and insofar, in the sense that special economic zones can help ameliorate the economic conditions in that area, and then by this wider reform effect and helping create zones across the whole country, you can basically have an area that benefits from a special economic zone around the whole country. Then you can have the country as a whole benefiting from more investment, more jobs, more economic growth, and all that comes with that, right? So more infrastructure, better sanitation, better electricity, all that. So I think there's a very clear economic case to be done for the establishment of these zones, and it's already being done, right? We're already seeing more zones getting approved and more zones getting implemented. So it's just going to be a matter of, okay, in 5 years, how many jobs were created by this? How much foreign investment was brought, and then use those numbers to show like, hey, we should maybe go a step further, right? Go get even more of this over here.
So at the moment, with the various organizations you're working with, do you have any projects that have a Brazilian element to them? Do you have any influence on what's happening in terms of the policy conversation there in Brazil?
Influence? No, I I don't have any influence in the Brazilian government. We do have a good amount of connections inside Brazil. So for the people of Abrasp, for example, the Export Processing Zones Association, good people, also lobbied for the reform for a long time to try to get it passed. The people at the Free Market Parliamentary Front, for example, is another organization that has been working very hard on promoting special economic zones in Brazil. So shout out to them. And yeah, so we have some people who are active in Brazil, but we're not directly involved with any zone projects in Brazil at the moment. But maybe, if there's another reform, we're also going to be glad to cover it and try to help promote it.
Okay, well, Francisco, thanks so much for explaining all of that detail about what's happening in Brazil in terms of the private cities and the special economic zones. And it's encouraging to hear that some reforms are being made to the zones that make it likely that there could be some more, positive developments in the space going forward. So I really appreciate you providing that introduction. For people that want to find out more about you or your work, what would be the best place for them to do that? Can they follow you on social media? Do you have any particular websites or links that you'd like to refer to?
Sure. My personal social media is @friendlitvay, pretty much anywhere. If you want to learn more about special economic zones, charter cities, and in all these topics that we've been talking about, visit adrianoplegroup.com. That's the company I'm involved in. And to check the open zone map, the project that we're mentioning with all the zones in the world mapped out, visit openzonemap.com.
Okay, thank you so much for coming on, Francisco. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me, Peter.